Good afternoon. How wonderful to see you. It's really encouraging that you're here, and thank you. Welcome to the third annual shared lecture hosted by the Faculty of Law, the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics, and the Department of Computer Science. My name is Christina Penner, and I'm joined by our fellow hosts, Dr. Katie Sloggy from the Faculty of Law and Dr. Neil MacArthur from the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics, and I am from the Department of Computer Science. Over 3 years ago, Katie and Neil and I came together with a shared curiosity and, to be honest, concern about who holds power over the technologies that shape our lives. Is it the largest corporations? The legal system? Who owns our data? How do we protect ourselves online? What role should the government play? These are big and complex questions. This lecture series offers a shared space to explore them together, to wonder, to question, and to learn. We're so glad you're here with us today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I guess my job is now to tell you the name of the series, which is on the poster. It's Code, Courts, and Conscience. So for those of you who are interested in perhaps attending future lectures, we will be publicizing them. You can join the Facebook page of the Center for Professional Applied Ethics, or find out through the Faculties of Law or Computer Science. I wanted to take a minute by way of a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the wrongs of the past, but also just maybe to ask us to take a moment to think about, because of the nature of this lecture series, I think we should maybe take a moment. We're surrounded by technology. It's very visible in this room. And we should think about the ways in which technology has contributed to the harms of the past, to colonialism, and also to the degradation of our natural environment. And then maybe also we could think about the ways in which technology might potentially offer some hope for the future, or at least be part of a solution to the problem that it has itself partly created. So hopefully as we use our technology, we can use it intentionally in a way that can acknowledge its impacts on Indigenous people, on the environment, on the society, and also look forward, hopefully, to a better future. Thank you. Katie?
Thanks, Neil. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Geist to the University of Manitoba. Professor Geist is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. One of the founding members of the Center for Law, Technology and Society, the Center for Internet and Public Policy, and he's a frequent podcaster, commentator, public advocate, and really just about the best guy to talk to if you want to know about the direction of technology policy in Canada. It's a real honor to have him here visiting us, and I hope that we all learn a lot from his expertise. And so please welcome Professor Michael Geist.
Great. Wow, it's a really big crowd. Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out. I have a hard time getting my kids to spend very much time thinking about tech policy at all. To get a big room, they would be, why are people here? So it's pretty great to see so many people come out. At a moment in time, I think, where, as we heard even through the land acknowledgement, tech policy is increasingly important, has enormous impact on so many aspects of our daily lives. And from a Canadian perspective, I think, I'm going to try to make the case that for the last number of years, I think we've really struggled to develop a coherent, sensible policy. And I want to sort of make that case, talk a bit about why we saw the government shift, why we started to see a shift back, and then try to propose at least a few approaches and kinds of solutions that we might think about. And I'll just preface this by noting that I realize that I believe the majority in the room are engineering students. We've got lots of law students as well. And one of the reasons I was so excited to have the chance to come and give this talk and have this focus is that your voices and your knowledge on these issues are going to be critical. It has been too often, as I think you will see, that as we have sought to craft digital policies in Canada, the voices who have technical expertise, often those that have legal expertise, have been missing from the discussion. And so if you take away anything from this discussion, it's that your voice really matters on these issues. It's more than an opportunity. There's certainly an opportunity, but I think there is an imperative to ensure that you take some of what you learn and become active within your own communities, whether that's on the engineering technology side or on the legal side or on the ethical side, and I think become a contributor and an important voice, because there's a real opportunity here to do that right now. So I'm going to start with this picture here. I suspect everyone will recognize in this room, I believe the person in the middle there, the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I suspect most of the other people are a little less recognizable in Ottawa and Ontario. Some of the people a little more so. We've got the former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, is there. The former Mayor of Toronto, John Tory, is there. And just over from former Prime Minister Trudeau is Eric Schmidt, who used to lead Google. This picture was taken, I think it's 2017, at an announcement creating a project known as Sidewalk Toronto. It was going to create a smart city, so-called, or a smart section, actually a smart couple of blocks. In the city of Toronto, as a caveat, it was part of an initiative with Waterfront Toronto. I served actually as the chair of an advisory board that Waterfront Toronto struck to consider some of the issues associated with this smart city initiative. And at the time, you had a government, Trudeau's just a couple of years in office at the time, who is incredibly excited about the prospect of standing quite literally shoulder to shoulder with Google, talking about the kind of benefits that bringing Google to Canada, they were going to set up their corporate offices in this space, and bringing companies like that, it was sort of emblematic of what the government wanted to, the message the government wanted to send about being a real leader when it came to innovation. Now, within just a couple of years, they talked about how this was going to be a real leadership project, and within a couple of years, the project was dead. Partially, I mean, there was COVID-related issues, there was changes from a financial perspective, but most fundamentally, the reason that this project went away was that the policy frameworks that were needed to address the kinds of issues that come up when you start thinking about embedding within our communal societies these kinds of different technologies to create a smart block or smart neighborhood or whatever this really was, simply weren't there. So you had Sidewalk or Google trying to make it up as they went along. You had the committee that was looking at these issues, our advisory committee looking at it. And you quite frankly had many in Toronto saying, hold on a second, what exactly is this? Now I have to say that sort of from my perch, I found both the criticisms overstated. This was hardly a takeover of the entire city. It really was just a couple of blocks. But at the same time, I think some of the responses from Google were nowhere near adequate. They were quite literally making this up as they went along because the government hadn't taken the time to do it. But that notion of government seeing itself as aligned with Google, by 2020, I don't think Trudeau would be interested in being in the same city as a Google executive, much less on the same stage. So something changed, and that change began to permeate how Canada approached digital policy. Now, it wasn't just with respect to Google. We saw similar kind of things take place with respect to Amazon and many of these large tech companies that I think today many look at with some amount of trepidation, oftentimes active users of these services, but at the same time, I think a clearer recognition or concern about some of the challenges that they might pose. So in this instance, this was Amazon, in 2018, announcing the launch of a distribution center in Ottawa. There are lots of cities, of course, have these very large Amazon distribution centers. I mention this because I was told by someone that was associated with the company that when they were going to announce this, they wanted to know if there wanted to be any political support for it. Anybody want to show up like for the groundbreaking, when politicians put on a hard hat and pretend to be digging something. And so they approached the government, and the Prime Minister's office was, well, would you like the Prime Minister to show up? Well, I mean, the PMO and the Prime Minister are not showing up to a groundbreaking for Amazon anytime soon. In fact, if anything, what we are seeing is increasingly aggressive investigations of companies like Amazon, largely on competition grounds and the like. So we have seen a really significant shift. I'm going to tell you why that shift in a sec, but there's an awful lot of people here. Why don't you just take a sec? There's, at a minimum, there is more space along the side there, if you like, or at least a little bit in here It's up to you if you want, but it looks, you just look so uncomfortable.
That door locked. It is now unlocked. Yeah, so there's another door, guys. If you come around, you can congregate on the other side. It'll be so much more comfortable.
Okay.
And you sit on the risers.
Okay. All right, good stuff. Thank you for coming. But yeah, there's lots and lots of space there. Not so comfortable, but better than being crowded over there. Okay, so what do I want to try to do here? I want to talk a bit about why we saw this shift. Why did we see this move from government seeing itself as closely aligned with large tech companies to one in which they begin to have real reticence of being identified as being part with them? Why didn't the shift in policy that came out of that work? I sort of gave away my perspective with the title. I think that we have seen real policy failures when it comes to digital issues in recent years. I want to talk through some of those various things, and then I want to try to talk a little bit about what comes next. Okay, so why the shift? I think we can identify a number of different reasons why or when some of this began to take place. Part of it was a cultural related issue. So Melanie Joly, who is now the industry minister in Canada, she used to be the foreign affairs, global affairs minister, and back in 2017 was the heritage minister. And Joly was looking for a mechanism to sort of put her stamp on the portfolio and wanted to take a closer look at the intersection between culture and digital policy. How do we regulate the large companies? What contributions do they make, whether it's film or television or music and the like? And so she struck a large consultation that was designed to look at precisely these kinds of issues. She held consultations across the country. She went visiting down in Silicon Valley and met with a whole range of different companies there. And while some came back with the expectation that this was going to lead to sort of a new, updated, modernized version of regulating some of these larger platforms, Joly's response was to say, I came back with a deal. Netflix has agreed to invest a minimum of $500 million, $500 million in film and television production over the next 5 years. Hooray. Now, the reality was Netflix was likely to spend that amount of money anyway. In fact, they spent more than that. I think it was in the first 3 years of this deal than was even required to, because Canada is one of the leaders when it comes to engaging in film and television production. We've got a really significant sector here. The response, though, that she received, particularly in her home province of Quebec, was universally negative. So many saying that our concern is not necessarily attracting some additional dollars. Our concern is what comes of some of our culture, what comes of ensuring that we've got a presence on some of these platforms, what happens to some of the policy mechanisms that we've long had in place that are designed to support the creation of Canadian content through film, TV, and music and the like. So the government gets a bit of a wake-up call when it comes to that issue. It gets another wake-up call when it starts seeing some of the violence that takes place online, particularly on some of the larger platforms. So Macron leads an initiative in France around cyber attacks. There is the Christchurch event where an attack is live streamed on Facebook, and suddenly you've got governments that say there are real issues here that we need to be dealing with, and this wholesale embrace of the innovative benefits of these large platforms is at a minimum misplaced because we are not paying enough attention to some of the negative consequences that may arise as well. We see as well the emergence of the Cambridge Analytica story, which many of you may recall, this notion of data available through Facebook that is used by this company, Cambridge Analytica, which sparks enormous concerns about the applicability and effectiveness of Canadian privacy rules, but not just Canadian privacy rules, of privacy rules more broadly in this online environment, and the notion that these companies, which are such huge repositories of collecting enormous amounts of data and using it for any number of different commercial purposes, were viewed as being ungovernable when it came to data governance-related issues and the protection of privacy. And lastly, and I think in many ways most personally, there was Catherine McKenna, who at one point in time was the environment minister. She actually has a new book out on that experience. I think it just came out in the last month or so. And McKenna faced an incredible amount of misogyny and attacks both online and offline. She was an Ottawa-based member of parliament, and there were incidents that took place quite literally at her constituency office within Ottawa, so much so that her safety had really been placed at risk in many instances. And I have to say that it shouldn't take being one of your own to face some of these issues for this to go on someone's radar screen. But in this instance, I think it's fair to say that it did. For many members of parliament from across the political spectrum, when you talk to MPs, whether Liberals or Conservatives or NDP and the like, it was the kinds of things that McKenna began to face that really served as a wake-up call for many, that what was at one point in time viewed as this universal good. I'm going to be able to broadcast and exchange with my constituents. I'm going to be able to engage in public consultations. There's all kinds of things that I can do with these new sorts of technologies. Suddenly there was a realization that there was a dark side as well. So we begin to see, as I say, a real shift in perspective from the government as any number of events begins to highlight that there are risks here as well, and a digital policy that up until that time had been largely, I think, premised on a hands-off approach, one in which innovation was good, these companies were good, and so more was good. And there was a realization that while there was still good to be had, there were risks here that had been left unattended from a policy perspective, and there was a need to rethink some of the approaches. Now, the problem I would argue that we ran into was that some of the policies that we did adopt as part of this U-turn or this shift, I don't think did much good. In fact, in many ways, I think they did harm as well. In part because I think the lessons that we took were largely that, well, if these companies are bad, the best way to approach these companies is to make them pay. Well, it may well be value in making these companies pay, but the approach that we took in some ways had negative consequences that I was about to say were unforeseen. They were not unforeseen. Many people foresaw them, but nevertheless, we went ahead with them. So what am I talking about? Well, I can think, for example, of what was Bill C-11, is now known as the Online Streaming Act. This was an attempt by government to update long-standing broadcasting rules in Canada. So we've had for many years in Canada a Broadcasting Act that largely regulates things like television broadcast, radio, and the goal was to modernize this legislation, in the words of the government, to incorporate the internet as part of it. Now, I think there is a strong case to be made that we need to think about what are the appropriate rules, but in many ways what the government sought to do was to say, well, the approach that we took when it came to conventional broadcasters, basically we give you a license, we have some amount of regulatory power over what you do with that license, and we require you to pay, make contributions out of the revenues you generate to help support various policy initiatives. We are simply going to take that and apply it to the internet. So we want these internet companies to do the same kind of thing. We want the Netflixes and Disneys and Amazons, Spotifys, to make mandatory contributions as well. We want to have some say in what you see when you use some of these services and seek to regulate them in much the same way. Now, this legislation attracted an enormous amount of criticism, initially not so much from the large streaming companies, but much more from the government's effort to incorporate not just the large streamers, but YouTubers and TikTokers and podcasters and frankly many others who use these platforms as individuals to speak out. I've got a podcast called Law Bites. We spoke to a lot of different people and government officials and privacy commissioners and artists and the like as part of it. And on that podcast, the notion that I would be treated in the same way as Netflix or as CTV or some other broadcaster seems rather odd. For those that make a real living out of these services, the people who are on TikTok or other kinds of digital influencers took a look at this and said, you're creating an enormous amount of risk to my ability to succeed online. I'm finding audiences not just in Canada, but audiences around the world. I'm not looking for support programs. I'm looking to ensure that the field is as level as possible, and I've got the ability to reach as many people as possible, and the algorithms that are used by some of these organizations aren't going to downgrade me because I happen to come from Canada, which was one of the risks that was identified with policies that would sort of tweak the algorithm in Canada, which might have the effect actually of having a negative effect of how people would view the content once you left the country itself. And so a lot of opposition gets sparked. The bill actually doesn't pass in its first iteration. It comes back. Eventually it passes, and then the other side of the coin hits. The large streaming services themselves say, hold on a second. Some of the requirements here, both in terms of the mandated payments, but also in terms of having a regulator, in this case the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, which regulates television, radio, and now internet, some of these internet-related services, injecting them into what the mastheads look like, in terms of what your feed looks like. TikTok provides videos in a stream of package of 8 at a time when you scroll through TikTok. So the people that you follow are going to be a bunch. There'll be a couple of others that are related that TikTok's algorithm believes you might be interested, and then there's usually a wild card or two as well within that pack of 8. The idea that you might have a regulator begin to determine what that pack of 8 looks like, or what the 6 videos look like that are often displayed on a YouTube page, struck many as a source of concern. Now, this legislation is currently before the courts. This was the head of the CRTC just a few days ago, a week and a half ago, appearing before committee saying that we might have to revisit this legislation altogether. Now, this was foreseeable. The approach not of trying to ensure that these companies would become active participants within the ecosystem, but simply trying to layer on the conventional regulatory approach for television and radio and saying we can just apply it in pretty much the same way when it comes to the internet, never made a whole lot of sense, and now it may become dust depending on what happens with this court case. Similar kind of story with respect to the Online News Act. This was Bill C-18. This was legislation designed to support Canadian media outlets who, as I'm sure many know, have struggled in recent years. And the basic notion here was that you could get some of the large platforms, not some, 2 large platforms, Meta, Facebook and Instagram, plus Google, to help pay and support money that would then go to local media. The problem, of course, was that, well, unsurprisingly, neither company really wanted to pay. In the case of Google, there was, I think it's fair to say, not necessarily comfort with paying, but a recognition that the value that accrued to Google when it would index all news articles to try to enhance the value of its search engine, or at least the effectiveness of its search engine, provided some amount of value. Google would argue and did argue that there was a reciprocity there, that what Google would be doing would be sending links back to the original source, and so it was driving traffic back to the publishers, which at the end of the day was much of their business model. But they at least saw that there was value there. In the case of Facebook, Facebook was like, why would we want to pay anything for news articles? Not just because it's Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg raises a whole host of ethical related issues, I think, for many, but rather because they would say, listen, we're looking at this, we don't actually index anything when it comes to news. It's our users that choose to post, and we simply create a link that sends that traffic back. So we have both no foreseeability in terms of what might get posted on our site. We don't copy anything. We simply send the traffic back to the original source to begin with. And so the response of both companies, at least initially, was, if you pass this legislation, we will simply stop linking. Canadian news just isn't valuable enough to us to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to compensate for the privilege of linking to it and sending those users back to the original source. Indeed, in the case of Facebook, Facebook tried to ensure that the politicians understood that their whole business model, as I'm sure many of you, as everyone will know, is to gather as much data as possible about their users so that they can serve as many ads as possible, which means trying to keep your user on the platform for as long as possible. The whole goal is to keep them there, learn about them, and serve up ads that are relevant. Viewed in that light, news is like the worst content. News sends people away from the platform, which is not what you want. And so the idea that Facebook couldn't live without news was laughable. But nobody was laughing, or at least media companies weren't laughing, when Facebook followed through, or Meta followed through with exactly what they'd said they would do. That if you pass the legislation, we will simply block access or block the links on our platform, which is what they have done now for more than 2 years in Canada, causing enormous harm, certainly to some of the larger players, but particularly to some of the smaller players, who often would begin to develop their audiences through social media and found one of the primary outlets that they would use to try to find those audiences lost. Here we find ourselves in much the same place as we found ourselves with C11. So C11 may be gone by virtue of the courts. C18, the Online News Act, new Prime Minister Carney has indicated they may reconsider that as well. The cost of blocking these links outweighs the benefits that we've seen. So a couple of instances of attempts to deal with this that haven't worked out as well as we had hoped. We saw, frankly, initiatives to deal with online safety, which, as I mentioned off the top, was viewed as a serious concern, raising some of these same sorts of issues as well. Some of their initial proposals, I must admit, felt like a bit of a grab bag of some of the very worst policy proposals from countries around the world, which resulted in at least an initial response where even those groups that were most likely to be supportive of attempts to deal with online harms said, pump the brakes here. Some of what you have in mind have significant consequences. Using, for example, automated systems to identify behavior online that then reports those users on an automated basis to the police raises all sorts of concerns for communities whose relationship at times with local law enforcement can be fraught. We can't simply turn that over to monitoring of the platforms and algorithmic identification of potentially harmful stuff. But yet that was at least initially what the government had in mind. It cancels that and goes back to saying, okay, fine, we're going to engage in consultation, brings back a new bill that significantly shifts and reshapes, but overreaches again, getting into not just dealing with what the platforms do or ought to be doing, but raising issues that raise both criminal and other speech issues in which even those, again, that might have been supportive of making platforms or creating legal requirements but for platforms to act more responsibly suddenly found themselves concerned. And by the time the government realized that these concerns weren't going away, last December, just before the government fell, and said, okay, fine, we will split the bill and we will take out, at least for the purposes of this study, the areas of the bill that have been brought in and sparked some of these concerns, it was simply too late. Government Trudeau steps down a month later, we get prorogation, and the bill itself dies. And so the opportunity to deal with an issue, as I say, just about everybody recognizes is a concern. In fact, in many ways, it's part of what precipitates the government to rethink the need for regulation, and yet overreach and mistaken approaches, again, ultimately sink this attempted approach. Not to sound like a broken record, but we could look at privacy and see the same sort of thing, where there is virtually nobody who looks at Canada's privacy rules, which by now are more than 25 years old, and argues that they are fit for purpose. Just about everybody would recognize that legislation that has its origins in the 1990s, well before the social media world of today, much less the large cloud services and the kinds of concerns that arise, it simply doesn't have the sorts of penalties that are needed, the enforcement mechanisms that are needed, much less what are viewed as sort of basic table stakes when it comes to ensuring that you've got a modernized privacy law. And yet what the government does here is brings forward this legislation with a lot missing and with a whole AI package as part of it as well. When people begin to say there are concerns about this approach, the response of the government and the minister at the time, Champagne, Francois-Philippe Champagne, was to go to committee, the committee that reviews this at the very start of their hearing, and say, I've got a whole series of changes that are planned on privacy and on AI. And when members of the committee say, okay, can we see them? He says, no. You'll see them at the very end of your study. Go study this old bill. I'll show you what the new one will look like at the very end of the process. Now, ultimately, the government reverses on that and releases some of their proposed changes. But once again, by the time the government folds earlier this year, C27 is still just actually in a review, what's known as clause by clause. They're still looking at each of these individual clauses, both because of how slow the government was in prioritizing this issue, and also, quite frankly, because it decided that what it really needed to do was include artificial intelligence regulation, AI regulation, as part of the puzzle as well. Now, AI regulation has proven to be one of, I think, the most important and yet troubling issues when it comes to how the government has addressed this issue. I mentioned that they included it as part of this package with respect to privacy. There's François-Philippe Champagne again announcing a code of conduct alongside this AI regulation, and quite frankly, it never really went anywhere. It left, though, advocates for AI regulation desperate for an actual consultation and opportunity to talk about what their concerns were. It left AI companies and other technology companies concerned that there was going to be overreach. Now, it too is largely in the dustbin. We have a new AI minister. That's Evan Solomon, a former broadcaster. It's not a great picture, but nevertheless, we got Evan Solomon as the AI minister, who has talked about Canada having over-indexed on AI regulation, which sounds like consultant speak for saying we are going to engage in far less regulation than we initially envisioned. The initial approach was largely modeled on European approaches. It has fallen somewhat out of favor, and yet the concerns that AI raises and the need to have certainly greater transparency associated with AI, greater remedies when there are harms, has itself never been greater. And then lastly, not to pick on Champagne, there is the digital services tax, which raised a whole host of certainly bilateral related issues with the United States. You can make the case that we want to ensure that companies pay their fair share. I think everybody would agree with that. Whether the DST, this digital services tax, was the right way to do it, I think has been the subject of considerable debate. But here again, the government, at least from a strategic perspective, never made a whole lot of sense, whether it was under Biden or under Trump. This was always raising significant kinds of concerns, so much so that if we go back just to June, as you'll see in a sec, the CBC didn't even change the picture. Canada, on June 19th, you see Champagne saying that Canada is moving ahead with the DST. That effectively meant that the companies who on a retroactive basis were liable for 3 years' worth of tax collection, billions of dollars, is that all this was going to happen by the end of the month, within 10 days. 10 days later, Canada rescinds the digital services tax to advance trade discussions with the United States. CBC running literally the exact same story and just needed to change the headline. And so within 10 days, Donald Trump says we're going to stop negotiations with Canada on some of these tariffs if you go ahead with the DST. And so Canada blinks and drops the DST. Now, this was entirely predictable. I can recall that I did a talk in February of last year. We still didn't know who was going to lead the government, right? We didn't even have an election yet, hadn't been even called yet. And when I was asked, well, what is going to be the leading digital policy issue in terms of strain with the United States, it was a no-brainer. It was going to be the DST because there was billions at stake, far more than any of these other issues, and the bill was coming due in June. Yet the government, as you see, said, we're doing it, and 10 days later they say, well, we're not doing it. That, to me, when you bring all of this together, is emblematic of what I think has really been a failure of vision, a failure to think strategically, a failure to really identify what some of the issues are and the challenges are to come up with a forward-looking, effective digital policy. It's not about not regulating, but ensuring that we've got effective regulation that meets our needs and identifying what some of those needs are. Well, why did we see some of this take place? I think we can think of a few things. One, I think there is what I would describe here as consultation failure at times, in part because this feels as consultation theater. Think, for example, of that online streaming act, the Broadcasting Act. So this didn't come out of nowhere, this idea of requiring these companies to pay and engaging in some amount of potential algorithmic regulation or at least promotion regulation when it comes to some of these large platforms. We can go back just a couple of years to the CRTC, which conducted its own own study on this issue. So now we've got the regulators saying, what does it think this regulatory world should look like? And it comes up with this study called Harnessing Change, the Future of Programming Distribution, the Future of Programming Distribution in Canada. I mean, the starting title gives it away, Harnessing Change. So we've got the regulator in Gatineau believing that it can harness these activities, these large international players, and it's got the power to do that, and it's going to provide the playbook to try to do that. That gives way, as it identifies a series of regulatory moves, that gives way to This study, which became known as the Yale Report, led by Janet Yale, a former telecom executive, called Canada's Communication Future, A Time to Act, brought together a study, and it said, you know what, the CRTC's got a lot of really good ideas. And so it consulted with a whole lot of people. I remember I had a chance to talk with the committee, but quite frankly, many of the outcomes were foregone conclusions. Now, if you start with that as your foundation, and you say you are going to listen to what people think, you're going to talk to the digital creators, you're going to talk to companies large and small, you're going to talk to individual Canadians about what they want to see happen when it comes to communications in the online environment, you might end up there or you might end up somewhere else. But if you start with where you know you're headed, based not on any sort of consultation, but rather based on something largely driven by a handful of stakeholders who have done well under the old system and are looking for ways to preserve that in the new, you end up with something like C11. You end up with instances where, in the case of C11, you had creators, including in this instance, Indigenous creators, who met specifically with government officials and came out of their meeting saying that they had felt gaslit, that they raised the opportunities that they were identifying, and came away saying, you know what, I didn't think the government not only was it not listening, it wasn't even respecting the kinds of perspectives that we had. And I think the reason for that is that the cake was baked, so to speak. They knew where they wanted to go, and they had made those decisions in effect years earlier, so that all the consultation that takes place later is largely illusory. It's basically theater. We saw much the same with respect to the Online News Act. I mean, the government didn't wake up one day and say, hey, we should make Google and Facebook pay for the news. We can go back to 2017. This report here called the Shattered Mirror Report, which back then, years before this legislation is introduced, driven again, frankly, unsurprisingly, by some of the same beneficiaries of this policy, come up with this report that say, hey, this is where we need to go. Now, there were any number of different policies included in this report, but the media picked it up immediately when it came out. What it fundamentally was calling for was squeeze cash from Facebook and Google. This is 2017. This is 8 years ago. And it took years until it finally made its way through, but what you end up with are rules that where the potential harms were quite predictable. So much so that you even have some of the smaller media outlets saying, hold on, we're concerned ourselves. The way that we see real opportunities in the digital environment, and we fear that we are going to be excluded ourselves and we're going to face harms from this legislation and have little to gain from it. We saw similar kinds of issues with respect to online harms. I mean, yet, as I mentioned, all sorts of issues with the online harms. When the privacy commissioner is asked, did anybody ask you about online harms and the privacy-related issues? The response is no. Nobody even bothered to ask. And when they did ask, as I mentioned, the response was very, very negative, but they didn't want to release the responses. And so the government, rather than releasing the responses they got to their consultation on online harms, provided a sanitized what we heard report, in which said, here's what we heard. They didn't like it, but you know, it wasn't so terrible. I launch an access to information request and say, I'd like all the submissions. It turns out you had some submissions comparing the Canadian approach to North Korea when it came to some of this stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's reality, but you can bet that was not in the government's summary of what they actually had heard. And so if you're engaging in consultation, you've got to actually take that consultation seriously. You've got to be willing to listen. You can't say that you're surprised by a US response when in 2023, a year and a half before we cave on the DST, you've got the US ambassador under a Biden administration sort of trying with large signals to say, we've got concerns that may ultimately spark some sort of response. And so the failure to consult, the failure to listen is part of that consultation, a big part of the problem. A big part of the problem is the way in which we do this from a governance perspective as well. For me, one of the most stunning aspects when I went through the process with respect to the online streaming bill was the way in which the committee went through what's known as clause-by-clause review. So for those of you that may not remember from your childhood sort of how a bill becomes a law kind of cartoons that used to show up at times. In Canada, how a bill becomes a law is it gets introduced and it goes to a committee eventually for study, and that committee then goes through what's known as clause by clause, where it does individual review of each clause. Members of Parliament have the ability to propose amendments, they debate it, they may include those amendments, and they ultimately vote out a new bill that incorporates all of this into the process. Well, when the streaming bill made its way through, government was anxious to try to get it through as quickly as possible, and they get tired of the opposition introducing new amendments and engaging in debate. And so I can recall at one point in time, the government says, okay, we've had enough of debate about these amendments. And so what they say is what we are going to do instead is say that after the clock strikes, it's not quite midnight, after the clock strikes, I think it was like 6 p.m. that day, all further amendments will not be subject to debate. They will simply be introduced and voted on. And it was so bad that they didn't even describe what the amendments were. They were simply numbered. It was G6 for the Green Party's 6th Amendment, or C23 for the Conservatives' 23rd Amendment, and then they would vote. So anybody even following this, for Canadians that might want to come into the committee to actually see democracy in action as they vote on these amendments, weren't even entitled to see what the amendments were. They simply rode through all of them. Well, that's not effective governance. I don't think that's effective. I don't think that's effective at all in terms of ensuring that you're actually taking on board what you've heard from people and then actually having proper debate about it. Or there was C18, that online news bill, where the government decided, despite some of the outcry and concerns, that they only needed 4 meetings worth of witnesses to talk about it. Not included in that list, Facebook. So you've got legislation that is going to require a company to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in support for a sector, and you take an approach that says we're not even willing to hear from you as we study this legislation. Doesn't make any sense. But that was the governance approach that we saw take place. There is another bill that deals with age verification technologies, and you're going to hear, I think, in the coming months, lots more about seeking to use age verification as ways to address some of the issues that arise online. And in this instance, what we saw took place is that there's a proposed bill that has been brought up a number of times by a senator, Julie Miville-Deschênes, and yet they're rushing through. People are talking about privacy-related issues, and the privacy commissioner says, okay, we're going to do an exploratory consultation on the concerns of using these kinds of technologies, facial age estimation technologies, or other sorts of tools that are designed to try to either guess or confirm someone's age before they're able to access certain content. Well, if you were doing governance right, wouldn't you try to get the privacy issues right before you deal with the legislation, not afterwards? But yet that's exactly what we've done. Or we, again, on the digital services tax, moved ahead without thinking about what some of those implications might be. Now, finally, there is, I think, a market or technology failure, a failure of government to take on board what's really taking place. To listen to some, you would think, let's say, in the film and television sector, that Netflix has been a disaster, that we're going to run out of money in order to create new Canadian content. When, in fact, the amount of Canadian film and television production in Canada, there's been more spent on it in recent years than ever before. There's been more spent generally on film and television production in Canada than ever before. Why? Because some of the largest investors in film and TV, well, they're Netflix and Disney and Amazon that are actually spending in Canada, and yet we've got policies premised on trying to mandate spending that in many ways is already taking place. Or mandating or finding mechanisms to try to deal with how do you ensure that Canadians get exposure online. This is not necessarily the right audience for Super Simple Songs, but Super Simple Songs is one of the most successful channels on YouTube. It is the most successful Canadian channel on YouTube with audiences in the tens of millions. And it is a smallish outfit based in Toronto. They've got about 25 to 30 employees. They have puppeteers, they have musicians, they have other creators. And so much so I can recall I was in Lao PDR in Laos. It was a year or two ago, doing some digital policy work, and I'm talking with some of the policy people, and we're talking about Canadians, and I mentioned Bieber, and they're like, yeah, we know Bieber. And then I say, oh, and you know what, you've got young kids. What about Super Simple Songs? And this person's eyes light up, and she brings out a jump drive and says, this is what we listen to every day because this is how my kids learn English. And all around the world, people are learning English through super simple songs. It's a great cultural export, and I'm going to guess that there are, at best, a handful of people in the room who have ever even heard of it. And yet, that's the case for policymakers as well, who too often don't even know what is really taking place. I mentioned they often don't really know the business model of social media. If they did, they wouldn't have threatened to block, they wouldn't have looked at the threat of blocking news links and said, well, this is just an idle threat. They would have known that, viewed through Facebook's prism, removing news from the platform is a gift. It isn't a threat. The opportunity to get people to spend more time on memes and people's photos is far more profitable for that company than various news articles. And so we've struggled to get some of these issues right. Let me close by talking a little bit about how to fix it. And I don't really have a lot of solutions about how to fix it. I've spent a lot of time trying to unfix or address some of the issues that are out there. Now, I think what we are going to hear a lot about, it's pretty obvious, over the coming weeks and months, is this notion of digital sovereignty, which I think, in some respects, if we get this right, has the ability to really be an effective guide. It does have the ability for us to say, okay, what are the real risks that we face as a country, and how do we develop policies and laws that respond to what some of those risks are? But if we get it wrong, if we treat this as sort of a new version of we need a made-in-Canada solution, which is often what has driven some of these earlier policies, we are simply going to see some of the same stuff that I just described brought right back again, and it will just be in a new package, and we'll say something like the Online News Act or the Online Streaming Act is about Canada's digital sovereignty. And it's not about Canada's digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty speaks to about where some of our data is stored, about the policies and rules that we have to ensure that Canadian laws are applicable and ensuring that the Canadian laws that we have in place are fit for purpose and modernized in an effective way when we're talking about things, let's say, like data or cybersecurity or some of the online harms that can arise. That's where I would argue that we need to focus on, and it doesn't mean we need to reinvent the wheel on all of these issues, but we need to identify where the real harms are as opposed to using the elbows up digital sovereignty sort of line that we're seeing right now as an excuse to bring back what in many instances have been failed priorities. And so how do we do some of that? First, if you have a dozen or 20 policy priorities, you have none. And so we need a government that decides, okay, this is what we need to accomplish. We don't need to find ourselves at the end of a runway of yet another government, and people are again talking about Bill C this and S that and C this, none of which made it to the end because they were omnibus bills or they included a whole range of problematic things. What are the things we really have to get right? We have to get privacy right. It's more, as I said, more than 25 years old. It's the starting point when it comes to data. We have to get some of the infrastructure-related questions right in terms of ensuring that Canada has got that in place. And we've got to deal with an effective harm system to ensure that some of these large platforms, it's not about paying their fair share. It's not about making web giants pay. It's about ensuring that they act responsibly and face liability where they fail to do so. We need to avoid stakeholder capture, which is in part where you come in. If the only voices that they are hearing are the same stakeholders that can afford to pay lobbyists and to bring forward the same sorts of proposals again and again and again in their own vested interests, we're likely to end up at the same spot. And so we need people who see futures in these spaces, who have spent much of their time online, can help identify what some of the risks are and as well as some of the opportunities. We need, as the slide suggests, evidence-based policy making rather than policy-based evidence making. In other words, we need policies that are based on the actual evidence, not working to develop evidence that then helps justify the policy. And too often we've seen that. I've tried to highlight how in many of these sectors, much of the evidence that is used isn't real evidence based on what is taking place right now. We've got to do a better job of governance. There is reports today, and there's sort of hopeful reports today that another piece of legislation that I haven't talked about, lawful access, the government is likely to pull back from it. It speaks to the prospect of warrantless access for law enforcement. for too long, under successive governments, whether liberal or conservative, making changes and addressing concerns that arise with particular pieces of legislation have been viewed as a weakness. The idea that you presented something and then study it and then say, well, it was perfect the way it is, and we don't want to make any changes. And so you defend whatever got promoted initially, even before you've actually engaged in the consultation, is the wrong way of doing it. The way you do it is to say, we want to make the best possible piece of legislation. None of this stuff ought to be particularly political. And the way to do that is to say you are open to change. And there are reports that we will see a real change when it comes to online harms. And now our unlawful access. And finally, I mean, it's trite, but we need to ensure that we are looking forward, not backwards. Too often when it comes to this, we look at the harms or we look at the concerns of yesterday and say that's what we are going to address. When it came to the Online News Act, as an example, I remember I ran a piece in the Globe just as this bill was about to be passed saying, does everybody realize that this bill says not one word about generative AI and things like ChatGPT? If you are concerned about what's happening with the media and how people find and access news online, putting forward a bill that deals with linking online and says not a word about what happens with respect to the creation of large language models and the use of news and what that might mean for the sector, means you have introduced legislation that is out of date quite literally the moment it's passed. We've got to try to get out of that bubble, which is not easy in the context of legislation because the processes, as you saw, can be very, very long. But if we fail to begin to try to anticipate where things are going and develop rules that are as modernized and up-to-date as possible and forward-looking, we find ourselves in this continual cycle of having out-of-date regulation when it comes to technology in the internet from the very moment it's introduced. And so that's why I think we failed and a little bit about how to fix it. But I'll reiterate and close with this. Fundamentally, the way that we ultimately address these issues is to ensure that our voices are heard. And very often we do have MPs in government that are open to hearing, or at least say that they are open. What we need are new voices, people who come with the kind of backgrounds and interests that you have. And so I'd really urge you to say, listen, if this stuff matters to you, get engaged and seek to make your voices heard. Thanks so much for your attention.